Well, this story is going to be fun this morning, the story of Adam and Eve. One of the things that we have learned from author and storyteller Gareth Higgins is that there are many ways to tell a story. For those of us who follow Jesus and have the Bible as one of our sacred texts, how we tell a story includes how we tell Bible stories. So many of the stories in the Bible that many of us have been told to instill fear in us. Fear of God, fear of sin, fear of hell, fear of never being good enough. Fear is one way that the institutional church has maintained some semblance of control over people. The portion of Gareth's book that I read for the Now Testament reading is a good example of that. The Catholic Church maintained control over people through the use of confession. One's entire life as a faithful Catholic revolved around needing a priest to absolve one of wrongdoing, and the result was a kind of magnifying glass focus on shame and guilt and a deep need for both the church and for the priest and for God. Catholics weren't the only ones doing that, though. Most Protestant churches have engaged in some form of that, also focusing on the same kind of guilt and shame and fear. So I thought it would be fun to look at this story of Adam and Eve because it is literally the first story in the Bible where the word fear is actually used. And like many stories in the Bible, when we think of the story, just like we do at Christmas time, we add all kinds of details into the story that we think we've been told over time because it has been told so many different ways. So the story that Ben read this morning, the story in the Bible, has been told as a story of a demonstration of original sin. Now, original sin, remember, is a theology. It's an idea that came into being many hundreds and hundreds of years after the story was written in Genesis 3. And original sin is the idea that because Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they were cursed, thrown out of the garden, and sin has then been passed generation through generation because all humans came from them. And because they sinned, sin was then passed on. That's the idea of original sin. So that's the version that many of us have been told about Adam and Eve. Now, I want to tell a little bit of a different story, but before I do, I wanted to point out that in the cursing, because we didn't read the cursing part, so in the cursing part, God cursed the snake, cursed Eve, cursed Adam, and supposedly kind of cursed humankind. And we know it was cursing because of the word used and then threw them out of the garden. So it's important to know that in that first version, the cursing happens because of God's anger. God is just so angry and upset with them for eating of the tree that then the cursing happens. So I wanted to bring that in because we didn't read that part. I would almost think parts of that story are funny, except that there have been very real consequences for generations and generations because of the telling of that story. And the biggest example of that is the consequences for women because of how that story is often told. That the woman was the one who gave into the temptation of the snake, and then the woman made the man eat also. And because of that, there are ramifications to this day on women. If it weren't for that, I would do some humorous things with it, but we have to look at the very real consequences. But version 2, which is what I want to tell this morning, is going to be told with the help of a feminist theologian by the name of Lynn Bechtel, who wrote a very important article titled "A Myth About Human Maturation." And in this version of the story, the version that I'm going to tell you, there is no fall of any kind, but it is simply a coming-of-age story about how humans come to understand their vulnerability. So here's the story. After God made earth and sky, God took some soil and formed a human and blew life's breath into their nostrils. The human came to life, and God planted a garden in Eden and put the human in it. God grew fruit trees of every kind, and in the middle of the garden, God grew the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God settled the human in the garden and told the human to farm it and care for it, and then told the human to eat from all of the trees and all of the crops, but not the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if the human eats from it, the human will die. And then we're told in the story, and so also in this story, the human was lonely, so God brought all of the wild animals and the birds of the air to the human to give them names to see if there could be a partner for the human. And the human ended up naming all of the animals, but the human was still lonely, so God put the human to sleep, took one of the ribs, closed up the spot again, and then God made another human and brought that one to the first one, who said, "She will be called a woman because from a man she was taken." They were both naked, but they were not embarrassed. In the garden was a snake, and the snake approached the woman and asked the woman if God said they could eat from any tree. And God said they asked the woman, oh my goodness, I'm trying to go too fast. Asked the woman if God said they couldn't eat from any of the trees. The woman responded by saying they could eat from any tree, just not from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or they would die. The snake convinced the woman she wouldn't die, and that the fruit from that tree was delicious. So the woman took from it and ate it, and then shared it with the man. After they ate, the humans came to a whole new level of self-consciousness and became aware of their own vulnerability. In wanting to gain knowledge, they gained an understanding of their own ability to make decisions. In wanting to have the knowledge of God, they gained deep knowledge of their own humanity. When God came strolling into the garden that evening, the humans told God of their new understanding about themselves. God's response was to share more knowledge with them, including some of the hardship and pain that is part of life when one is human. And so the Adam chose that moment to give the Adamah the name of Eve, or life, meaning mother of all life. God released them from the garden and into their lives together in relationship with and also separate from God. Well, I'm pretty certain that none of us were ever told that version of the story of Adam and Eve, a story of coming of age or a story about human maturation. In a commentary for workingpreacher.org, Professor Juliana Classens writes, "The primordial story in Genesis 3 forms part of the ongoing process of the current and future generations discerning what is good and moral and upright. For instance, Lynn Bechtel challenges the traditional view of reading this story in terms of the fall by reading this story as a story of human maturation. One could say of falling upwards, as the humans in the garden are moving beyond a childlike state of naivete, their loss of innocence associated with growing up and facing the realities of life in a grown-up world. This ancient coming-of-age story thus speaks of the importance of humans embracing their role as adults who are prepared to take responsibility for their actions as well as for those around them. How we tell a story to ourselves, about ourselves, to others, or about others has far-reaching consequences, especially related to the fear we feel and experience. When our identity is such that we focus on every single thing we do wrong, every way in which we are less than perfect, we tend to cultivate a life of fear. When our older daughter Emily was in middle school, she was at a public charter school that worked a lot on social and emotional learning in students. When she started there, she was in the 6th grade, and the discipline system they taught was that if a student did something wrong, they took responsibility for what they had done wrong, and they filled out a green slip and then put it in the basket for the teacher. On the green slip included what they had done. An example might be if someone left their backpack on the floor and then someone else tripped over it because they had all agreed not to put their backpacks on the floor, they would then get up and fill out a green slip and move their backpack. Eventually, there were consequences depending on how many green slips you had. I think if you had something like 10 green slips, you were responsible for staying in at lunch and helping the teacher with a task that would help the whole class. You get the idea. So when we had our first student-led conference that year, because the students always led their own conferences, we got to hear from Emily how she was doing. She told us about her classes and her work, and then toward the end of the conference said with pride that so far she had not gotten any green slips. Her teacher then came and sat with us at that point and talked directly to Emily. She told Emily that one of the areas for growth for Emily was to start getting green slips. She explained it really well to her. She told Emily that middle school is a great place to be able to make mistakes and learn from them. Instead of being afraid to get green slips, she encouraged Emily to be able to let go of her fear and just let herself be and let herself make mistakes. She told her that making mistakes and learning from them is a necessary part of how we grow as humans. I really appreciated her encouragement and how she explained it to Emily, because Emily at that time in her life was so hard on herself and always felt like she had to get it just right. The day Emily got her first green slip, she came home from school and cried. But it was the best thing, because once she got one, she wasn't afraid anymore. And though she never racked them up in huge numbers, she got her fair share, which meant she was able to allow herself to make mistakes and learn from them. What if we told the story of the creation of humans not as though it were the first and forever fall from grace and perfection, but as the very real story of how humans come to self-understanding and consciousness of vulnerability? What if we told our own stories from the perspective of the mistakes we had to make in order to learn the things we had to learn? I once had a conversation with a seminary classmate of mine who was a very dear friend. He had been divorced, and I had been divorced, and we saw each other a few years after that by the time we had both been remarried. He told the story of his divorce as a fall from grace. He was grateful that he had been forgiven by God for his sin of divorce, and he would always see himself as having sinned in that way. He saw my divorce in the same way. I told him I had a different perspective, and that I did not see my divorce as a fall from grace. I saw it as part of my maturation and part of my growing process, and that I was learning from the mistakes I had made. I was grateful for the opportunity to learn and grow, and that my regret and my sorrow was that my family was hurt in the process, but that I didn't think of it primarily as me betraying God or letting God down in some major way. He just didn't see it that way. When you are taught a primary identity story, like the story of Adam and Eve and their big fall, you develop a framework by which you live that consists of your own seeds of evil and the ways in which you fall from grace and need to be saved. My friend lived within a framework like that. I'm not sure if he still does. In her commentary, Juliana Classens also points out that most of us breeze right over the part of the story that talks about this beautiful scene of intimacy where God is strolling through the garden at the time of the evening breeze. I want you to let that sink in for a minute. The story has always had that part in it. God is strolling through the garden at the time of the evening breeze. How many of us have ever told that part of the story? How many of us have ever even paid attention to that part of the story? Where in our life stories do we talk about God who strolls with us at the time of the evening breeze or the morning sunrise? Gareth Higgins points out in chapter 3 that we give so much power to authority figures in our lives, and then we spend our lives fearing them. The Adam and Eve story has been told from the perspective of God as the authority and Adam and Eve as fearing God. The story never says that Adam was afraid of God. The story actually says Adam was afraid because he realized he was naked. Nakedness is such a symbol and experience of vulnerability. Is there any greater vulnerability than being naked? How can we become wise about who and what to give authority in our lives? What if the Christian story, what if our own personal stories could be told differently? What if perfection doesn't factor in at all and never has? And what if a fall from grace and needing to be saved or rescued doesn't factor in? What if we built the kind of beloved community where we are brave enough to be able to make mistakes and get green slips and take responsibility for making right the mistakes we make? What if our Christian faith is about the ways God walks with us and relates to us and stays in relationship with us as we learn and grow, and develop into communities of justice and care? What if God didn't send Jesus into the world as a way to rescue us from God's wrath, or require Jesus' death in order to save us from sin? At the end of this third chapter of his book, Gareth Higgins invites us to consider rituals that are life-giving and rituals that are not life-giving. I would add to that the invitation to consider the stories of our faith that are life-giving and the stories of our faith that are not life-giving. This story of Adam and Eve has never been a life-giving story for me. I don't know about you. There is nothing life-giving in it. It's a terrible story of the beginning of humanity. And what about the stories of our lives? Which of the stories of our lives are life-giving and which are not? If the story of your life is about the monumental ways you have screwed up, that is not life-giving. How could you tell that story differently? How could it become a story about courage in making mistakes and learning from those mistakes? If the story of your faith is about how hard you have tried to please a God who will never be pleased, that is not a life-giving story. How could you tell that story differently? May we as a community continue to create brave spaces here and elsewhere for people to share the stories of their faith or their no faith and their stories of their lives as humans in this world. Amen.